We're going to talk about the psychotic spectrum disorders today. So about 1% of the population ends up with some type of psychotic spectrum disorder. Typically, this strikes in the late teenage years, sometimes in the early 20s. Often see this happening to college students. It happens to men at a younger age than women, can result in very severe social and occupational dysfunction. And the outcome can vary greatly between individuals. There are several phases of schizophrenia. In the beginning, it's called the pre-morbid phase. There are very subtle motor cognitive changes, maybe some social changes. Maybe the person just looks a little bit different or weird. As time goes on, in the prodromal phase, we see an increase of mood, cognitive, and social impairment, and then ultimately, full syndrome, we see a great deal more deterioration. The decline worsens over years and then generally plateaus. There's an increased risk of suicide as well as comorbid AODA and a decreased life expectancy. Here are some of the major categories of things that can go wrong, determining which genes will play or what changes will be made to the playlist, resulting in different responses. So there can be a DNA malfunction, a gene expression dysfunction, perhaps a virus or a toxin, nutritional problem. Perhaps this is from birth, and perhaps some psychosocial experiences have contributed. We know that the development in utero can play a huge part with the neuron formation, the migration of neurons, synaptogenesis, pruning, apoptosis, and then changes due to life experiences. So all of these things can go wrong and will affect us in different ways. Some will end up with attention, memory, language, executive dysfunction, and emotional dysfunction. Others will end up with psychosis, such as delusions and hallucinations, along with paranoia and possibly aggression and violent behaviors. Okay, so we consider psychosis a positive symptom. So there's an abnormality in perception. Often there is disorganized, incoherent, or illogical speech. So we see the little kitty cat here turning in from a sweet thing to a dragon that's going to eat you. And so just a presentation of what can happen to a person having psychosis. They're hearing voices, they're seeing things, they're having grandiose visions and ideas. They think the radio is talking to them, and there's a great deal of paranoia. Then we have negative symptoms. These are the lack of behaviors usually present in normal people. Some studies show that the negative symptoms have been actually more impairing than the positive symptoms. The negative symptoms affect relationships, education, and jobs. We've actually known that people can function with the positive symptoms. An important thing to track with your schizophrenic patients is their level of socialization, their friendships, relationships. This slide is just showing that the syndrome of schizophrenia has a mixture of symptoms. They're commonly divided into two categories, positive and negative. The positive would be delusions and hallucinations. The person is out of touch with reality. The negative symptoms show the loss of normal functions, problems with feeling, loss of interest in things. And so here on the slide, we see a list of the negative symptoms. There's actually 5 of them. The first one is called alogia. This is a dysfunction of communication where there's a decrease in fluency and ability to think clearly and to speak. Then there is the affective negative symptoms. This is where we see blunting or flattening. So there is a restriction in the range of the emotional expression. There's also what we call asociality. So a decreased social drive and interaction with others. Anhedonia is a decreased ability to experience pleasure. And avolition is a decreased desire, motivation, or persistence, and a decrease in goal-directed behavior. So some key negative symptoms that you can observe. The person may not be speaking as much. They'll say very, very little. Their grooming is not as good. They may not have bathed. The eye contact may be less frequent. And when you ask them questions, they may not be able to recall emotional experiences. If you ask them what their interests and hobbies are, they will have perhaps very little to tell you. And they may have very few friends or no friends. In this slide, we see schizophrenia here in the center. We're looking at matching this to the malfunctioning brain circuits. And so the negative symptoms are from the mesocortical prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens. Cognitive symptoms are from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Aggressive symptoms from the orbital frontal cortex and the amygdala. Affective symptoms from the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Positive symptoms from the mesolimbic area. Okay, this slide is showing us the production of dopamine. Dopamine is produced from the amino acid precursor tyrosine. It's taken into the neuron via a tyrosine transporter. It's then converted to dopamine and packaged into the vesicles via the VMAT2, and it will be stored there until it is released during neurotransmission. This slide is showing the termination of dopamine, where the action is stopped. So dopamine could be transported out of the synaptic cleft back into the presynaptic neuron via the dopamine transporter, which is DAT. It can be repackaged there in the vesicles. Dopamine may also be broken down with an enzyme COMT. And other enzymes that can break down dopamine are MAO-A and MAO-B. Here it's just showing you the dopamine receptors. It's the dopamine receptors that regulate dopamine's transmission. The dopamine transporter, the DAT, is presynaptic. It clears excess dopamine out of the synapse. The VMAT2 takes up dopamine into the vesicles for future use. There's also a presynaptic dopamine D2 autoreceptor. This regulates release of dopamine from the presynaptic neuron. In addition, there are several postsynaptic receptors. These include D1, D2, D3, D4, and D5 receptors. We know the most about D2 because it's the primary binding site for almost all of our antipsychotic agents, as well as dopamine agonists that are used to treat Parkinson's disease. Okay, here we're seeing the presynaptic D2 autoreceptor. What is an autoreceptor? An autoreceptor is a gatekeeper for dopamine. So if there's no dopamine, they open the molecular gate. Okay, here we go. We're on the right slide now. Okay, so the autoreceptors are the gatekeepers for dopamine. If there's no dopamine, they open the molecular gate and allow dopamine to be released. If there is dopamine, the gate is closed and prevents dopamine from being released. Presynaptic D2 autoreceptors are located on either the axon terminal or on the somatic dendritic area. Okay, this is the dopamine theory of psychosis. It came from experimentation with stimulant drugs. When there was an increased dopamine in the limbic system and in the prefrontal cortex, the resulting symptoms looked like psychosis. So an overactivity of dopamine in the limbic system results in positive symptoms. An underactivity of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex results in negative symptoms. Our antipsychotics block the dopamine receptors. It's an antagonist action. There are two main groups, D1 and D2. There are also two subtypes in D1 and D5. In D2, there are three subtypes, D2, D3, and D4. Most of the antipsychotic drugs have affinity for the D2 subtype of the D2 family. D2 receptors are found throughout the entire brain. And so when you give an antipsychotic, you are blocking the D2 receptors throughout the whole brain. But dopamine is needed in the prefrontal cortex for attention and focus and executive functioning. If there's not enough dopamine, we have emotional blunting. If there's too much dopamine, we have manic racing thoughts. This is the area where a cocaine or a stimulant would overload the dopamine. Dopamine is needed in the limbic system. If there isn't enough, there is very low emotional response. If there's too much, there's mania, aggression, paranoia, and psychosis. Okay, here we're talking about the dopamine pathways. There are 4 or 5 pathways, depending on who you talk to. So the first generation antipsychotics used to treat psychotic spectrum block D2 receptors throughout the whole brain. If there's not enough dopamine in the mesocortical area, we're going to have a problem with cognitive function. If there's not enough in the mesolimbic area, we're going to have a problem with emotional functioning. Not enough in the nigrostriatal area, there's a problem with muscular control or movement. In the tuberoinfundibular area, this controls the prolactin release, and the antipsychotics can cause galactorrhea and gynecomastia. Okay, so this is again looking at the 5 dopamine pathways in the brain. It helps to explain the symptoms of schizophrenia as well as the both therapeutic and side effects of the antipsychotic medications. The nigrostriatal pathway projects from the substantia nigra to the basal ganglia or the striatum. There it is. Controls motor function and movement. The mesolimbic dopamine pathway projects from the midbrain ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens, which is a part of the limbic system of the brain. This is involved in pleasurable sensations, euphoria, and too much dopamine, audio and visual hallucinations. The third pathway is the mesocortical pathway, going from it's going from the ventral tegmental area to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and this results in cognitive and the affective symptoms of schizophrenia. The fourth pathway is the tuberoinfundibular dopamine pathway. This projects from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, and it controls prolactin release. And here's just showing you a separate slides of the mesolimbic pathway. And And here's the mesolimbic area showing the positive symptoms of hallucinations and delusions. This is showing the mesocortical pathway. And resulting in cognitive symptoms and negative symptoms. This is showing the mesocortical underactivity resulting in cognitive, negative, and affective symptoms of schizophrenia. And the fifth pathway travels to multiple sites in the brain, including the thalamus, and the actual function is not known. So we can't just blame the dopamine. There are also major glutamate pathways involved in schizophrenia. So we know that glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. Glutamate stimulates the dopamine neurons. That results in an increase in dopamine as well. GABA interneurons inhibit glutamine and so decrease glutamine, and that results in a decrease in dopamine. We also know that the NMDA hypofunction on a on a GABA interneuron can result in an increase in glutamate, which in turn will result in an increase in dopamine. An increase of glutamate can cause damage to the neurons, and too much glutamate resulting in excess dopamine can cause psychosis. This is showing the pictorial representation of NMDA and glutamate's action at the NMDA receptors. The NMDA receptors are dependent in part upon the presence of a co-transmitter, either glycine or D-serine. Glycine comes from dietary amino acids and can be transported into the glial cells either by a glycine transporter or by a specific neutral amino acid transporter. Glycine can also be produced in glycine neurons and in glial cells. So this is not something you're going to be expected to know, but just so you're aware that there's more than just a dopamine excess in psychosis and positive symptoms of schizophrenia. This is showing the key glutamate pathways, which we're not going to study. This is showing NMDA receptor hypofunction resulting in positive symptoms of schizophrenia. And we have talked before about how genes don't directly cause mental illness. However, an abnormal gene can cause a malfunction in the nerve, which can result in mental illness. Here we have the hypothetical gene for a symptom, behavior, personality, or temperament. Again, the abnormal gene can cause the neuronal malfunction, resulting in problems in behavior and personality. So remember that genes don't directly encode for mental illness. They encode proteins. And so in some cases, the genes can produce genetically altered proteins that in turn code for molecular abnormalities, which in turn can be linked to the development of psychiatric symptoms. This can occur during neural development. It can occur at the serotonin transporter area. It can occur at axonal and dendritic protein synthesis. It can occur at the signal transduction pathways and can occur in the synaptic plasticity machinery. Enzymes involved in the monoamine degradation may also be altered. We talked about the nature versus nurture in the stress diathesis theory of schizophrenia, and how vulnerable genes combined with life events will result in a biased circuit, which can result in decompensation of the neuronal circuit. And ultimately hallucinations, delusions, and a thought disorder. This shows that we think DISC1 involved during neurogenesis may be involved in the development of schizophrenia. There's also susceptible genes can converge on the NMDA synapses in schizophrenia. And this can affect the connectivity, the synaptogenesis, and neurotransmission of the glutamate, specifically at the NMDA receptors. So there are multiple susceptibilities at various synapses in schizophrenia. Okay, and this slide we've seen already. To sum up, dopamine has 4 or 5 major pathways. An excess amount leads to positive symptoms in the mesolimbic pathway. Deficiency leads to negative symptoms in the mesocortical pathway. Glutamate, our excitatory neurotransmitter. If there is a hypofunction of NMDA receptor on the GABA interneurons, this leads to decreased inhibition of glutamate release, therefore an increase release downstream of dopamine in the mesolimbic region.